Hi, we continue in Genesis 19 today with these verses. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called out to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." And based on those two verses, and as we'll see, virtually nothing else, this chapter has become a word in the English language, sodomy, or to sodomize, or sodomites, equating the people of Sodom with homosexual intercourse. And yet, as we'll see, there is nothing whatsoever in the story to support that. Nothing at all. Not only is it not about homosexuality, quote unquote, because homosexuality is an anachronistic concept in the biblical era, there's nothing about rape and there's nothing about sexual violence at all in the story once we look at it closely and don't assume that it means something that it doesn't actually say. And this was as surprising to me as I dug into this for the research I did for our video today, as it was to my wife Sue or others that I talked to about it, even though I've long been committed and written about in my book, Come Out My People, in 2010, about the story being about hospitality, not about homosexuality. But I had not seen the depth of which it is not about homosexuality or rape or sex at all. So to reach that conclusion, we use the tools that I've been using in all these videos that separate out invalid interpretations from valid ones, which is not to say the result of this video will be the quote unquote right answer, but we can eliminate wrong answers and create a space in which right possibilities, or at least viable possibilities of interpretation exist. And even once we do the work, there are still many areas of mystery or leeway where one can read it one way or another. But it is not about rape, violence against women, or sexual violence at all. The two primary tools we use, and if you'd like to know more about these, I encourage you to watch the introductory videos to the whole Radical Bible series, which are posted in a separate playlist, but is to look at the original language, the Hebrew, and understand what words meant in their own context, and then to look at the cultural context of the time, which to say not just the world in the story of Abraham and these angels in the city of Sodom, but the exilic world of the audience as we've been looking at. And if you want to know more about how I reached the conclusion that Genesis was largely written in the time of exile, you can go back to the early videos of Genesis and see that. So we're going to use those tools, and we're going to go through these verses, and we're going to see how it's not about that at all and where that might have come from. So as we do, we can see we're continuing in this chiastic structure here. So we looked at the image of the Sodom gates last time, and that part will be very important to the cultural context of interpreting the scene we're going to look at today. We're not going to go all the way through this. We're just going to go through verse 9 here, 4 through 9. There's enough to keep us occupied there. And there are other things on this chart that we looked at last time, including the many parallels between the flood and the Sodom stories. I won't go back over those now. Also, we've been looking at keywords, and plainly the key word in this immediate part is no, and the question of not know, the Hebrew yada, which we're going to look at in great depth, as well as bring them out, which we see a number of times, and the door, highlighting the in and out issues that are throughout the story, and that we looked at last time, and we'll look at again this time as well. Another aspect that we've been looking at overall, and this is also very important, is the connection between Genesis 19 and Judges 19. They're similar stories, but they're not the same story, and that's going to make a huge difference today. They both involve a person coming into a town as an outsider and being surrounded, being in a house and being surrounded by the local people who want to have the homeowner make the people, the visitors, come out so they may know them. And we see that parallel in the orange parts here. And then we see the master of the house objecting and offering a daughter instead. But then the stories differ, as we'll see. But just for now, here they do rape the concubine all night long until she's dead. But in our story, no actual violence or sexuality takes place. Is that just because of the angels, or is it because the people of Sodom never had violent, or at least didn't have sexual violent intentions in the first place? And that's part of what we're going to have to look at as we go. So why don't I keep this structural part up here, and we'll begin to look at our keywords, because we're going to come back to this in a minute to look at some keywords and translations. So what we hear described in great detail, how it seems like every male person in the town is there, emphasizing the men of the city, a double use of each man here to highlight that, and the men of Sodom, men of the city, the men of Sodom, which is obviously saying the exact same thing, both young and old. And it doesn't indicate how young. Babies, toddlers, almost certainly not, but there they are, young and old. All the people, which could include women, but plainly it's only the men of the town here. Not because they're gay, but because the public space is male space, and the women would be inside the houses, as Lot's wife and daughters are throughout the story, so that we don't even hear about them until the very end. And they surrounded the house. That would imply, of course, Lot's sons-in-law that will, or at least prospective sons-in-law, who are not living in the house with his daughters, but he goes and finds later, and they think he's yitzhacking around with them, which we'll get to when we get there, which is to say, not that he's trying to get them to actually take seriously that the city's going to be destroyed, but he's just messing around with them, and they end up being destroyed. So they, by implication here, are part of the group that surround their own father-in-law's house that includes their own daughters here. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" One of the things that was reminded of with the where question was how the where question connects our passage in chapter 18, where they asked Abraham, "Where is your woman, Sarah?" And we looked at that there. And now here, "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" Obviously, this is with divine questioning, and this is not. But we can recognize that that's something that connects these together here. That's not in the Judges passage, as we can see here. So let's go back to our structural elements here, and we'll look more at our story up close. "Bring them out to us so that we may know them." And if that's all translations had, we'd go back to what we did in the last video, and we'd look at how in this urban context, the people of Sodom are understandably concerned about Lot having let strangers into their city, potentially to spy on them. And in the last video, I showed a couple of passages, including Joseph's, pretending that he thinks his brothers are there to spy on the land, but also from Joshua, where Yahweh sends the Israelites in their journey back to the promised land from Egypt to go spy out the land for giants or for threats and things. So it would have been a very traditional thing for people on the move in a foreign place to spy out cities, whether that's to plunder them or to see whether it's safe to go near them. And so that would be the normal cultural context here. And the Sodomites are totally within their urban understanding of things right to be suspicious of strangers. In other words, what they want to do is know them. Where would we get any idea that there's anything else that they want to do besides know them here? Because that's all this text says. And then he will offer, as we'll see, his daughters who have not known a man and bring up the sexual issue, but they reject that completely, and there's no engagement with the daughters or the men sexually or otherwise at all. So where might we get that from? What's the problem here? So we need to go back to translations here. And the key word for know is yada. And in Genesis, yada is 57 times, and it's all these times as simply ordinary knowledge. It's these times as sexual knowledge or sexual intimacy or personal intimacy. So back in the first one, the narrator told us the Adam knew his woman, and she conceived and bore a child, and that became Cain. And the same thing with Cain in 4:17, and then with Adam and Eve again in 4:25. 18:19 is about personal intimacy, not sexual intimacy, where we heard that Yahweh knows Abraham. And then we're going to get to this one here where the daughters don't know a man. So that's about not having sexual intimate knowledge. And then we'll see others like that. One of the things we can also note is that nobody ever uses the word yada out loud to another character as an invitation to sexual intimacy. It's only either the narrator, as we saw in these examples, who says that somebody knew somebody else and that led to conception and childbirth, or the negative, as in here, where Rebecca has not known a man, or other people do not know a man. So nobody ever uses the word know with any out loud with any kind of sexual knowledge, and it's certainly never ever used with the implication of rape or violence, because it's about intimacy. It would be the least likely of the possible euphemisms for sexuality in Hebrew to be used that way, because it's used so beautifully in these verses here to highlight the intimacy of genuine sexuality between people who care for each other. There are two other words in Hebrew that have double entendres, that one of which is sexual intimacy, and they're used in Genesis 2. One is shub, to lie down with, or just to lie down. So we see several examples, including 19 here, 19:4, before they lay down, which is simply say before they went to sleep. And so we see that used in the normal sense of to lie down as in rest. But here it can be used in sexual intimacy, but it only implies any kind of force when it's used in the imperative. And ironically here, this is Lot's daughters, not the people of Sodom, but Lot's daughters who use it in the imperative against him, is used in 34 with the verb to take, lakak here, by Shechem about Dinah, and most people take that as rape. And then it's used the imperative by Potiphar's daughter twice against young Joseph, lie with me, which doesn't end up happening. And so even there, it doesn't imply any kind of sexual violence or rape or force, except in the imperative form. And the third one is go, the Hebrew word go, bo, which means to go. And it's used many, many times in Genesis, 168 times, and I didn't mark all those out. But it's used as sexual intimacy in the figure of speech to go into, and that's these times here. It was with Hagar, and it'll again be used with concubines. It seems to suggest a less intimate kind of sexuality than to know. Hence, it's used with concubines rather than relationships that we might presume have some kind of love and intimacy. In other words, not any of these words in Genesis is associated with any kind of rape or sexual violence, except when it's in the imperative or when it's associated with another word. It's just simply not. Despite that, English translations of Genesis 5 have put this before audiences. And so the red ones are the ones where there's some kind of sexual implication, and the black ones are simply where it says we may know them. I left this in black because know them intimately might mean get to know who they are without implying some kind of sexuality. But we see how many of them have sex with them or things like that. We want to force them to have physical relationships is an incredibly roundabout way to say it. And some of them even use other words that could have potential sexual implications that are not the word here. Like we may have our sport with them, which would imply the yitzhak word, which has a sexual connotation, but not in this way. And then others like that suggest going into or lying with or things like that, as we can see down here, implying some of those other words like lie with down here. But all of these that have the red in them are simply wrong because there's nothing in the text to support interpreting it that way, and everything, as I just showed, based on the words and the cultural context to say otherwise. So where else might it come from? I'd like to suggest it comes from the association between Genesis 19 and Judges 19. Even though for all the scholarly work that I could dig up on this, not one scholar can say what actually is the root relationship between these two texts. They suppose speculatively that there's maybe a third text behind them, but there's no evidence of that. I'd like to suggest, since Judges is almost certainly a pre-exilic text, one of the earlier texts from the Deuteronomistic history, perhaps as old as the 8th century, or maybe even older, maybe even from before the time of the monarchy, although it's hard to know, but certainly from the time of exile, because much of what's going on in Judges is setting up the legitimation of the monarchy. It ends with the verse of, there was no monarchy, so everybody did what was right in their own eyes, and setting up the possibility of monarchy. So the Judges story names the men of the city a perverse lot in English, literally as sons of Belial, which is a harsh term, always sometimes translated as scoundrels, but it's saying something about them more than just they're the men of the city, which our Genesis passage doesn't say. It doesn't say anything bad about them. It's just they're people of the city, and they've all come out, surrounded the house like here. And not only that, here they he ends up suggesting the virgin daughter and his concubine, and he ends up sending out the concubine, and they rape the concubine all night until she's dead and leave her on the doorstep, which leads him to do the horrible thing of cutting up the concubine in pieces and sending the pieces to each of the tribal representatives to begin a civil war against the people of Benjamin. In other words, it has a totally different direction of the story than the story we have here. For scholars that want to compare them from the perspective of violence against women or violence against LGBTQ people, which this chapter has been hideously used against it over the centuries, they want to contrast perhaps that there is no word for heterosexual rape parallel to sodomize, as in Gibeah, that's the city they're in here. And this story is not usually paid much attention to in Christian circles in the way Genesis 19 has been used as a weapon against LGBTQ people for many centuries, for long before there was anything called LGBTQ. If you want to know something of the background of that, we could look at this article from the University of Chicago Press, Christian Intolerance of Homosexuality, from the American Journal of Sociology, which shows that it goes back to around the 13th century when the word sodomy came to be a word in English. And here you can see an etymology of it, which is pretty common from the French and from the Latin. And as this article on Christian intolerance highlights, and the etymological link seems to connect, that medieval period was a period of great sexual intolerance. The aesthetic movement rose. It's when in the Catholic Church priestly celibacy became commanded, and it was largely anti-sexuality at all, and that permeated into the culture. Of course, the first church writers, as I highlighted in my book Empire Baptized, were anti-sex because they were Platonic philosophers and thought that sex, like any other passion, was frivolous and beneath the dignity of a serious person. But they were the elite. They were arguing in scholarly circles that didn't reach the ground. And as Augustine, writing in the 4th and 5th century, recognized, he was in favor of celibacy, but he knew for the ordinary people who attended his church where he preached every week, it was the best he could do to keep the men faithful to their wives and not worry about not experiencing concupiscence, the English form of the Latin word that he used for the pleasure of sexuality. So the elite attitudes that we might read in Christian history were not on the ground, and the Mediterranean region and the Christian world in general just did not make sexual issues much of a concern until the 13th century, and then it entered into English via sodomy, and here we are. So I'm hoping with this video, and we'll continue with it with the rest of our passage here, we can forever eliminate the idea that this story has anything whatsoever to do with homosexuality, and it actually has nothing to do with rape. It simply has to do with the city people wanting to know who are these people that this alien Lot has allowed into the city. Maybe he's conspiring with them to overturn Sodom, which would be a very realistic possibility. So with all that in mind, let's look at a few more verses. So Lot went out of the door, and this highlights all the elements that we've seen of inside and outside in our passage here. So we can see that Lot's in the house, and he comes out the door here to the men and shuts the door after him. So he's standing on the porch out here outside the house, which is a bold act on his part. And he says, I beg you, and again, as my key words thing noted, left out the please, which is common here. I beg you, my brothers, which he seeks to appeal to. They won't accept that. And again, that comes also from the Judges passage. Do not act so wickedly. And again, another please here. Do not please act so wickedly. And yet, what is the wickedness? What is it that he thinks is wicked? And that's explained in his offer, which is nonsensical, but we realize this is where it begins. I have 2 daughters. Let me go back before I get too far ahead. Yet another please here. Behold, please. I have 2 daughters who are apparently in the house and hearing him offer them like a sacrificial offering, who have not known a man. And here it is by this criterion, which is, say, they're virgins. It's one of several times where characters or the narrator notes that a woman is a virgin by saying they've not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, please. The politeness with the offer of bring his daughters out to be raped, and do to them as you please, or literally what's good in your eyes. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof, literally under the shelter of my beams or my logs here. And yet they reply, stand back, although the word here, nagesh, for stand back almost means the exact opposite, come near. And as Lynn Bechtel notes below, it's more likely that it's a sense of draw near that's happening. They say, this fellow, or literally the one, Ha'ekad, came here as an alien, as a gur, as a foreigner, which they still see him as, and he would play the judge, which goes back to the fact that he was sitting in the gateway when the angels came and met him, which would be the place of a judge, although he was not judging at the time, as far as we know. We didn't see that. Now we will deal worse or more evilly with you than them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. Again, the image of coming near, it's the same word as stand back here, to break it down. In other words, they have no interest in raping the daughters because their interest is not rape at all. They see this as a nonsensical distraction here, like offering them candy or something. You've come to know who these visitors here. Let me offer you my daughters so you can have some fun with them, as if it was a distraction. In other words, it's Lot who has no idea what's going on here. He's not only wrong in assuming that his neighbors could be perceived as brothers, which they don't obviously perceive, but or that they would want his daughters, or that his daughters would be wanted to go out there. Everything about what Lot's doing is the exact opposite of Abraham, and that is the point. The point is that Lot has been embedded in the city life for so long, not listening to Yahweh, that he's lost complete track of his role as a father, as a neighbor, and if he ever was, as a man of Yahweh. And that's where this story is going, because it will end with, yes, the city of Sodom destroyed, but it'll end with a focus on Lot and his daughters, who drunkenly force him to have sex with them and get pregnant as a result. So as we continue with the story, we'll see that it's all about the contrast, not only between hospitality in general, but between the life in cities with its violence and fear of outsiders, and the life out on the earth with its abundance and presence of Yahweh. And that's where we'll continue with it next time. See you then. Bye-bye.